The idea of a taxi cab came to me, this yellow metal coffin floating through the sewer of the city with this boy trapped inside who can't get out, who looks like he's in a crowd but he's desperately alone. And I said, that's who I am. I'm the kid in that cab. And I wrote that story as self-therapy because I had to create this character or else I was going to become him. I really don't care if you guys can write or not, because you can learn to write. What I care about is your problems. And if you can refine what's unique about your problem, one of the ways you refine this is through the metaphor. Then you have a channel of uniqueness. A metaphor is something that stands apart from the problem, yet is somehow linked to its secret. In fact, easier now to make a slow film because people are so geared for a barrage of visual and audio information that you just have to slow down a little and you're disrupting them. Plot is simply what happens when you take a problem and drive it through a metaphor. You can have a script that's extremely well written. You can have the same story poorly written, and they can both be a great film. So it isn't so much about the writing itself as it is about the story. Taxi Driver was my first script, and I wrote that as self-therapy. I was in a kind of a dark place, drinking and driving. I didn't have a place to live. I had a gun in the car, and I had a pain in my stomach. I went to the hospital, and it was a bleeding ulcer at the age of 26. And I realized in the emergency room that I hadn't spoken to anybody in weeks. And I had just been drifting through the city with this anger here in town, in Los Angeles, and with all this anger. And so I realized that it was time. I had to turn to fiction in order to get out of this place. I had to create this character, or else I was going to become him. And that character was Travis Bickle. And the idea of the taxi cab came to me, this yellow metal coffin floating through the sewer of the city with this boy trapped inside who can't get out, who looks like he's in a crowd but he's desperately alone. And I said, that's who I am. I'm the kid in that cab. And I wrote that story as self-therapy because I figured if I can write about him, I don't have to become him. And it worked. As I wrote about him, he became more and more detached from me. When I teach screenwriting, I usually, for the first class, I give a sort of lecture like this one. And then I ask everyone to write down in no more than 2 sentences each their 2 most pressing personal problems at this moment. I say, I will not be able to take all of you. We're only going to have 10 kids in the class. And I really don't care if you guys can write or not, because you can learn to write. What I care about is your problems. If you are in the class, your problems will become the joint property of the class. If you're not in the class, it's thrown away, forgotten. That often clears out a certain number of them. And then, we start. We don't talk about writing till around maybe 5 or 6 weeks in. It's all about therapy and group therapy and how you can use the medium of storytelling to understand your problem better. And the one thing that you have that is unique to you is your problem. Because even if it's the same problem as the guy next to you, self-image, can't tell my parents I'm gay, whatever your problem is, minority anger, it's not exactly the same as the person next to you because everybody has a different gradation. And if you can refine what's unique about your problem, and one of the ways you refine this is through the metaphor, then you have a channel of uniqueness, and then you're doing something that only you're doing. And that's, I think, the only way to get into this very crowded space as a writer. So each of you have your problem. Now you got to come up with your metaphor. Now, what is a metaphor? Well, a metaphor is not a simile. It's something else. A simile is like or as. My heart is like a dying star. That's a simile. A metaphor is something that stands apart from the problem, yet is somehow linked to its secret. So now we need metaphors for your individual problems. A metaphor is the stand-in. It is not the problem itself. So the metaphor for a lonely boy is not a lonely boy. The metaphor for an unattractive girl is not an unattractive girl. It's something like the metaphor, like the problem, but not the problem itself. It's like two wires. You have the problem and the metaphor, and they have to get close enough for a spark to jump across. And if they're too far apart, there'll be no spark, and if they're on top of each other, there'll be no spark. You get them like this, and then also you tip them a little bit, you feel the spark, bake it off, a little more, feel the spark. And when your theme and your metaphor are lined up right, sparks will go back and forth. So you have to tease them and play with the spark. Transcendental Style is essentially a withholding device. Most movies lean towards you. They lean toward you aggressively with their hands around your throat, trying to grab every section of your attention. These type of films lean away from you, and they use time, and as other people would call it, boredom, as a technique. Eventually, if you're smart enough on how you use these techniques, now you're doing something really rare. You're activating the viewer. And once the viewer starts to move on his own, it's so much more powerful. If you consistently withhold, and now the viewer is leaning toward you, now you have to, I think, in a certain moment, free them. Do something unexpected. In Ida, it's the tracking shot at the end. In Bresson, it's just a burst of music. You show a movie for an hour and a half, 2 hours with no music at all.
Quelque chose illumina sa figure.
Then all of a sudden at the end, boom, a big blast of Mozart. What are you going to do with something that aggressive? And the trick of someone who can use Transcendental Style is to suddenly freeze them. So like the characters in Ozu's films never show any emotion, and all of a sudden in the end, whammo, comes a big blast of emotion. What are you going to do with it now that he has totally conditioned you not to expect it? Is it going to put you off, or is it going to knock you up a notch? And that's the idea of the decisive action. And once you get that action, and then after that, silence. Isn't it really hard to go slow now that we've rewired our brains to process information at such a fast clip? So you're getting information very, very fast, and now you're starting to get multitasking information. I said, no, it's in fact easier now to make a slow film because people are so geared for a barrage of visual and audio information that you just have to slow down a little, and you're disrupting them. Plot is simply what happens when you take a problem and drive it through a metaphor. Okay, you have a problem. The problem is loneliness. You have a metaphor, taxi cab driver. Shove your problem into the metaphor. What happens? Well, you have a guy who's drifting around. He meets a girl he can't have, but wants. He meets a girl he wants, but can't have. He tries to kill the father figure of one and fails, so he kills the father figure of the other and becomes a hero. That is the entire plot of Taxi Driver, right there. And all that comes from is taking this loneliness and shoving it through a taxi cab and imagining what can happen. When you talk about withholding techniques or fulsome techniques, they are both manipulations. Yeah. But one is an active manipulation and one is a passive manipulation. So if I'm actively manipulating you, You do not have to do anything. I will do everything for you. I will keep you busy. I will tell you how to feel at every single moment. And but if I am passively seeking your emotions, you have to start to come toward me. And that starts to become your journey. And your journey will always be different than your journey and your journey. Whereas my active journey, it's going to be the same for all of you. I'm going to make you all sort of, feel the same buzzes at the same time and scream at the same time. But if I'm doing a passive journey, it will be different. And when people start to fill out the vacuum, they start to project themselves into it. And then kind of magical things start to happen. And you can't really predict them because you've taken people to a place where they're uncomfortable and they're going to do something about it. And one of the things they can do is get up and leave. And the other thing they can do is start to invest themselves in this situation. And like, if you create a character and you play this game where I would create a character that you identify with. And I set the hook, bait the hook, you bite. And after about 45 minutes, I've had the hook in tight. And then all of a sudden he starts to veer. And a man you have thought worthy of your identification starts to do things that you don't approve of. Now, how do you deal with that? What adjustments are you making as your identification is going awry? And those adjustments that you're making are the real work of the film. And I don't necessarily know what adjustments every individual person makes. And therefore, when people say, what's the real meaning of that? I said, I don't know, you tell me. Iris DeMent has a great song called Let the Mystery Be. And sometimes, that's the hardest thing for an artist to do is let the mystery be. I'm a big believer in the oral tradition. I do not think screenwriting is part of the literary tradition. It's a form of telling, of storytelling. And so that part and parcel of the process is not writing, but it's talking and telling the story over and over again. And, you can have a script that's extremely well written, and you can have the same story poorly written, and they can both be a great film. So it isn't so much about the writing itself as it is about the story. Every time I'm evolving a story, you start making outline. What are what they call the beats? What are the 8, 10, 15, 20 things that happen? Now, you don't really care what people say about your idea because they're not going to have that much of value to say. What you really care about is their body language. Do you have them? Do you have them? You can judge by their posture, by, and all of a sudden you're starting to lose them. It's just like a stand-up comic saying, I'm losing this crowd, I'm losing this crowd. And Raymond Chandler said once, if you get in trouble, have somebody with a gun walk in, because the reader is going to be so grateful he's there, they're not going to ask why. And it's the same thing is true. Here, I'm telling you this story. And then I say, and these two big black guys drive up wearing red suits in a purple convertible. Boom, I got your back. I also got these, black dudes in a purple convertible that I have to deal with. But I do have you back. Now I got to somehow work them into the story. And so you find yourself, as you tell the story, embellishing it in order to make it better because you're losing the audience. And also, every time you tell it, you can see from your outline where your different types of scenes are falling in. Exposition scene, comic relief, action scene, mystery scene, boom, boom, boom. And if you see in your outline, you have 3 exposition scenes in a row. Well, that's not going to fly. And if you tried telling that, you would see that right then and there, because you start telling person 3 exposition scenes in a row, and they're going to get bored. When I was beginning to learn to write, I used to even color code these outlines by exposition, action, humor, romance. So I could actually look at the outline in different colors and say, wait a second, you got 3 exposition scenes in a row here. And then you got a comedy, an action, a comedy. That's not, switch them around. And you'll figure that out when you tell it in person. And so if you can tell a story for 45 minutes and hold somebody, I think you have a movie. And if you're not quite sure, invite somebody for coffee or a drink and start telling them your story. And then toward the end of it, go up and go to the bathroom and come back, and don't resume it. If they don't ask you how the story ended, you don't have a story. And maybe your first outline is just a few items long. But when you come back from that coffee or that beer, you re-outline it, because now you've just thought of some other things. So maybe you had a little story with 10 scenes in it, but now it's 15 scenes. Oh, don't tell it again. And if you own them, you own them. And if you don't, you have to come up with something. You have to find those 2 guys in the purple suits. You have to find that comic relief guy. You have to be going down the street and a beautiful woman falls out of a window and dies in front of you. Anything to get them back. And then you say, well, that kind of worked. That the girl with the red dress and the yellow hair falls down and cracks her skull open. And they really bought that. I wonder how you can work that in the story. And so it builds. When I'm writing, I try only to think as a writer. I think of story, problem, metaphor, character, plot, dialogue. But I try not to think of images. And then when I come back to it as a director, now I think of images. And the image is not words. If I say to you, glass of water, that's 3 words. That's not a glass of water, that's 3 words. Here is a glass of water. That's a different thing. That's a different kind of idea. And that's how you have to start thinking if you're going to translate words into images. To me, there really is no script format. Although final draft tries to mandate how a script looks. I wrote my first script as chapters without scene numbers. Travis buys a gun, Travis meets Betsy, Travis drives. And just little chapters. I wrote First Reformed as chapters without numbers. I wrote the new one in chapters without numbers. Then, of course, the line producer has to go through all the work of numbering it, because how do you prepare a budget and a board without numbers? But for me, it works better without numbers. I've written a script in the past tense. I've written a script in Zowie language, like comic book language, bing, bang, boom, all that. Each story sort of tells you how it wants to be written. And so don't get so hung up on what they tell you a script is supposed to look like. If a script reads well, that's all that matters. And it's the same thing with acts. How many acts are there in a movie? Well, mostly there are 3, because we live in the past and the present and the future. We like to think in triads. But in fact, some movies have 5 acts, some movies have 1 act. Some movies have 2 acts. You know, and don't let anybody at any school or any textbook tell you it has to be 3 acts. It doesn't have to be. And don't let anybody tell you you can't have a scene that's 10 minutes long where nothing happens.